Hello and welcome to this How to Academy event with me, Matt Stadden, former presenter at LBC and the BBC and a former Telegraph columnist and now a regular How to Academy presenter. It's great to have you with us on this wet and windy late September evening here in England anyway. Our guest this evening, Ryan Holiday, is somewhere where it's not yet evening. He's in Austin or near Austin in Texas. And he's called Ryan Holiday. I think, well, I'm led to believe anyway, that he is the best-selling living philosopher, which is quite an accolade. He's written bestsellers, and I'm sure this one, if it isn't already, is going to be a bestseller because it's called Courage is Calling, and it gives us a very healthy dose, I think, of something very important, and that is to be brave, to live life as you mean to, not to give in to cowardice or fear. Ryan, it's great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you're in your bookstore, which I think you set up during lockdown, if I'm not mistaken.
I did, yes. So I was in the process of opening a small bookstore in a small town before the pandemic. And the months of lockdown gave me many, many long days to reconsider what an insane idea this was. But it now exists, and I'm speaking to you from my office upstairs.
And this was a passion project, and passion plays quite an important role in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme. I couldn't think of a worse way to make money than opening a bookstore in 2021. But yeah, I love books. I love physical bookstores most of all. I almost exclusively read physical books. And so it was something that was scary and intimidating and almost certainly going to be very hard. But I think that's part of what attracted me to it and why we stuck with it even when it got harder than we thought.
Thing is, you have got rich quickly because you're only 34 years old and you've written, as I said in my introduction, best-selling books, so bestsellers on the Wall Street Journal list, on the New York Times list. You also held down at a very early age a high profile, or a very important job anyway, a high-powered job at American Apparel. I want to know a little bit before we start, if I may, about you and this crazy success. I mean, you dropped out of college, I think about the age of 19. Where did it all go so horribly wrong for you?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can make money writing, but as you know, it's probably the worst way to do it, or the least efficient way to do it. It's been wonderful that the books have sold well and reached millions of people now. But at every step of the way, as I moved towards where I am now, which is writing about ancient philosophy, or rather writing about an obscure school of ancient philosophy, that was the wrong decision to make financially, right? I left college, then I left a Hollywood job, then I left a high profile marketing job. Then I was writing successful books about marketing, and I walked away from those for a substantial pay cut as well. So I've always tried to go towards like what I'm interested in, what I feel like only I can do, and what I feel like provides sort of meaning more than monetary rewards. It can just happen that you can get lucky and get both.
Kind of fascinating me reading the book, which is a terrific read, as someone who studied classics at university myself. You, having left college at about 19, as we've discussed, you throw around all these giant names of classical literature and philosophy as if you've been entrenched in this stuff all the way through education, yet clearly you're self-taught.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm entrenched with them in the sense that they have been my life now for many years. I'm fascinated by them. I love hearing about them. I love talking to, with, and about them. But yeah, my understanding of classical history comes from books I've read, questions I've asked, Wikipedia pages I've had to consult because I had no idea what the hell was happening. But I have slowly but surely made my way through not all of the classics by any stretch of the imagination, but a good chunk of them. And I think what's interesting is, provided you're reading them in your native tongue, they are often a lot more accessible than people think. I think part of what academia does to justify its own existence is to not just make it harder than it needs to be, but specifically raise up and celebrate the most dense and least accessible of the classical texts. I think part of the reason why Stoicism has always been sort of an underrated, underexplored, little known school has been that it's hard to specialize in that, right? It's hard to, there's not a lot of tenured, chairs of Stoicism, because it's kind of so straightforward and accessible. It's almost, its accessibility almost counts against it in a profession where specialization is a shorthand for, genius.
But you're very good at repurposing these guys for the modern day, which is a tribute both to them, that what they had to say is still relevant today, but also for you, for being able to repackage them in such an accessible way. So we're reading in the book about quotes from generals thousands of years ago, or what Seneca was up to, what Socrates was up to, and you communicate it to us as though it was written or spoken about yesterday, which is a skill.
Yeah, although I would say most of the credit is due to them, because not only were they great writers. I mean, I think you take someone like Marcus Aurelius, his Meditations, which remains a bestseller to this day, is the private notes of the emperor to himself. Just on the side, he accidentally creates one of the most brilliant works in all of philosophy, unintentionally so. But I think one of the reasons that they make my work easier in terms of making them accessible and applicable is that they were human beings like all of us, and they had problems and difficulties, and they were struggling to do what was right, despite all the reasons and the fears and the doubts and the seductive voices arguing against that very action. So, I mean, I think what I try to do is just get to what makes them a human being across the centuries and nationalities and socioeconomic hierarchy, but I try to go to what makes them just regular people struggling with life.
So let's get stuck into courage. I mean, the antithesis of courage is fear, and fear runs like a sort of deep seam through the book. In the depths of lockdown last year, Ryan, on my old LBC show, I drew on that inauguration speech of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, when I said that essentially there's nothing to fear but fear itself. You draw on that inauguration speech as well in the book. Tell us a little bit about the significance of Roosevelt and the depths then of depression, and why it's so important that we understand fear properly in order to be courageous.
Yeah, so if you think about when FDR takes office, basically every part of the system had failed. And not just recently failed, but failed despite best efforts for like the last 3 years of Hoover's presidency. And so just as now, Biden gave a similar speech after office. He talks about we can lose our faith in the ability of governance or human beings to solve tough problems. And that was what had happened. That's why there were runs on banks. That's why people were homeless. That's why people were turning on each other. We'd sort of lost, it felt like everything had fallen apart, and indeed it had. And I think what FDR realizes is that at the root of all of that doubt is that doubt is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't believe in the capacity of the state, of your fellow human beings to come together and fix this, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to move forward. And so fear is contagious, right? And that's what we see in economic crises or panics. When things start to break down, they break down further because we see them breaking down. And I think what FDR does a really good job of is sort of being the hard stop, right? He's like, look, things are really bad, but they're not going to get worse from here because we're going to move forward and try these things. And I it's one of the great moments in all of American history. Guy inherits the worst possible, set of circumstances you can imagine. It takes longer than he thinks, but he manages to turn it around, and he does more than turn it around, and basically, ushers in a century of American dominance going forward.
It's a very timely moment to be talking about this, because what you say about fear-inducing panic is going on arguably here in the UK at the moment, with panic buying of petrol. And some would argue that because people don't trust the government, or some people don't trust the government, or enough people don't, when the government comes along and says you don't need to panic buy, everyone immediately runs to the petrol pump.
Yeah, no, that is a huge problem. And we had a handful of those in the United States over the last year and a half, specifically with gasoline, but also with toilet paper and God knows what else. And it's hard to fault people in, like, government response has been incompetent. They have lied to us repeatedly. I think what often happens, though, is like people are rushing out to buy gasoline as if that's the solution to their problems. Like, in America, we have these viral photos that go, viral every time there's a hurricane or something, and you watch these idiots, filling up garbage cans of gasoline in the back of their pickup trucks. Then they all explode on the highway or whatever. It's like, I think people are going, things are bad, something is wrong. What should I do? I should do what everyone else is doing, which is buy gasoline. Of course, they could just stop and go, do I have any need for this gasoline? What would I possibly do with 100 gallons of gasoline? It's the same thing with a lot of the panic buying or panic preparations for disasters, where you're like, you understand that if we actually run out of gasoline, you're going to be so fucked that none of this, the couple extra gallons that you have are not going to be good for anything, right? It's wonderful that you've got gold bars under your mattress. But if there ever comes a situation where you need to use those gold bars, it's gonna be so bad that it's not going to be good that you have them. So I think as we kind of calm down and try to rationally think through what we're doing and why we're doing it, that can also be very helpful.
Just because I don't know who's listening, I'm just going to say sorry if anyone was offended by the F word. Now listen, Ryan. One of the ways that you use, or a very constant way that you use as a mechanism to get into the different themes of this book, which do basically and essentially all revolve around showing courage, because that's the title, Courage is Calling, is to use big names from the past, and sometimes perhaps from the present as well. We're not just talking about the classical past, we're talking about the almost contemporary past. So let's just use some of these big names as ways in to different elements of courage. Let's look at General Mattis, for example. And he was asked an important question, and he had a very interesting answer.
Yeah, a journalist asked the 4-star Marine general and then former Secretary of Defense. This is, I think, when he's still a Marine. The reporter says, what keeps you up at night? And he said, I keep people up at night. I love the cleverness of that, because, what keeps you up at night is a question about fear, right? What are you worried about? What's wrong in the world? What's out of your control? What should we be scared of? And I like that he flips it and he goes, no, I'm the one that people are afraid of. I'm in charge. I'm on the offense. And there's something to that I think is, I love that.
But this is about being on the offensive, isn't it? It's about being proactive. It's not. Yes. It's about not allowing nasty stuff to come to you.
Yeah, the things you put off. So Jeff Bezos talks about this. He says, I don't do bet the company bets, meaning he doesn't live conservatively, safely, status quo day in and day out. And then suddenly Amazon's behind the 8 ball and he has to take a big bet, right? He would prefer day-to-day initiative, being on the offense, taking smaller risks day to day, which are, some of those are liable to pay off over time, and then not have to be in this position of desperation where you have to gamble, you have to go all in because you were being too cautious, the last 10 years.
And this is about fortune favoring the brave, but as you say, perhaps incremental steps of bravery. And you say in the book that, fortune can favor you if you are brave, but it's not going to hang around forever.
Yes, that's right. And when we think about fortune favoring the brave, it's not that you're guaranteed anything, but that often being conservative, being risk averse, never trying, being defensive, as we said, panic buying, is almost often more dangerous than the alternative, right? So look, the future is scary. The future is unpredictable. You can sit around and hope that it shakes out in your favor, or you can go out bravely, boldly into the world and try to make a future that you've got a shot in.
Men who went bravely and boldly out into the world were those who were involved in the charge of the Light Brigade. And one of the points you make here is that people who can be brave in perhaps certain obvious ways are not necessarily brave in other ways.
Well, we have this distinction between moral courage and physical courage, right? And there's no question the charge of the Light Brigade is an exemplar of physical courage. I mean, they charged into certain death, right? But they also do it unthinkingly, right? As the poem says, theirs was not to reason why. But why not? Why didn't they say, why the hell are we doing this? This is insane. And in fact, after the charge, they come back. They've just seen that their commanding officers have sent them on a pointless suicidal charge. That was obviously a mistake that someone should have spoken up about. And they regrouped as if they were ready to go again. It was easier for them to charge into certain death a second time than to be like, guys, are you sure about this? Right. And I think the other wrinkle that I loved as I was researching the poem and the charge itself is Tennyson. He writes this, one of the great poems in all of history, about the courage of the Light Brigade. And yet he publishes it under a pseudonym because he's afraid of what it will do to his literary reputation to publish a poem in a newspaper for a popular audience. So there are many different forms of courage, and they're not all charging into battle.
And you also bring up with that anecdote the question of accountability and how people found it easier to risk their life than they did to take accountability for something.
Yeah, the two officers, as Cardigan and I'm forgetting the other one, but the Salisbury, I don't remember. But anyways, the two commanding officers, basically, they both realize it's a bad order, right? That it's a mistake. But they're like, it's not my fault, right? They're like, it's no skin off my ass. They're like, go for it, right? And they just pass the buck, essentially. And then after it fails, after it is proven to be one of the sort of most pointlessly bloody charges in military history, neither of them takes any accountability or responsibility. Of course, we saw this during the pandemic as well. Trump is asked, at the beginning, do you take any responsibility? And he utters a sentence that is utterly inexcusable for a head of state to say. He says, I take no responsibility at all. That is the job, right? The job is the buck stops with you. It's a lot of fun to be the most powerful man in the world, I'm sure. But the unfun part is that there's nobody above you that you get to pass it on to. It stops with you. And so ultimately leadership is about accountability. And so as you give an order, you have to have the courage not only to execute it, but to then own it, success or failure.
Part of the thing about courage, of course, is there's no guaranteed success at the end of it.
If there was, it's not really courage.
And so you quote Matt Damon from one of his movies in which he says, I think, something along the lines of, if you do 20 seconds of something really, really brave, I promise you it will work out. And our point about courage is those guarantees don't exist, or as you say, it's not courageous. But if you don't move, then fate might catch up with you, or the consequences of not moving might catch up with you anyway. So then instead of just dying, and I mean, not all courage is about life and death, as you describe in the book, but instead of just dying, you also then die a coward, and you use Cicero as an example of that.
Well, there's a great line from de Gaulle that I have in the book. He says, it's move or die, right? And he says, but moving does not preclude the possibility of also dying. And so I think that captures it perfectly, which is, look, if you stay here, you're going to die. If you move, you might also die, but there's a chance you could survive, or there's a chance something good can come from it. So as they say, all growth is a leap in the dark. So if it was guaranteed, if you knew for certain, if you could, to go to your point about Cicero, like Rome breaks out in the Civil War, and he's like, well, I'm just going to wait to see who the victor is, and then I'll side with them. That's not the hack that he thinks it is, right? Because the one who ultimately does win then regards him with suspicion for not being loyal enough, and then he ends up dying anyway, right? So we often tell ourselves, well, I'm going to wait and see, right? Or I don't want to commit just yet. Or we look at I have sympathy for Republicans here in the United States. Bucking your own party comes at real career risks. But there's real career risks aligning yourself with an unstable moron, right? So I think we often tell ourselves we're doing the safe thing, but that's really just because we've stuck our head in the sand and we're ignoring all the risk inherent in our morally conflicted, untenable situation at hand.